Hello everyone. I don't usually make videos like this, but I wanted to do a little bit of a warm up this morning, so I wanted to bring you guys with me and show you guys how I warm up. I'm gonna do a really quick, like 30-minute portrait of one of my favorite actors, Song Kang-ho. He was in the movie Parasite, a classic. He's so dang good. I've talked about this so many times on stream, so I thought I would do like I said, just a little 30-minute portrait or so. I might go a little bit over if I feel like I want to. But anyway, so I'm starting right now with a little gray screen. I've got a little timer up to see how long I go for. Also, I apologize. I haven't showered yet. I don't know why I decided to film this and show you guys what my face looks like right now, but I thought it would be better than just staring at me slowly drawing. So we will pop open the tab that I have for a timer and we will get going. So I'm going to start that bad boy and just arrange my screen here for a second. Okay, so always, I start off my portraits. Whoopsie daisies. I'm going to start with a nice round brush to sketch with. I'm going to go in really big and spend about 2 minutes kind of laying out all of the features from my reference. Now, obviously, if I'm not drawing with a reference, the process is going to be a little bit different, but anyway, regardless. So let's start by kind of mapping out the sizes of different things. I'm not going to worry too much just yet about the feature placement necessarily, like if things are too big or too small. That's okay for now. We're going to focus on that in the next layer that we create, but just kind of these general shapes. Sometimes I skip this step if I'm feeling confident and already warmed up, but I just started drawing, so that's not the case for today right yet. So we're gonna go in. He's got a really long nose. This reference is really excellent because just all of the lighting on his features is excellent, so it really shows off kind of the shapes of all of his different lovely features. So his hair is also huge in this reference. I spent some time looking at it. It's a lot bigger than I am anticipating, so I'm not really going to focus on his head too much for now. I really just want to focus a lot on his facial features. So we're a minute 36 deep. We've kind of got a little bit of stuff sketched out. I want a little more done on this layer before I move on, and then we will get to a little bit of line art. Not really line art per se, but a little smoother than what we've got going on right now. Okay, let's see. Like I said, perfect, 2 minutes. That is done. We're gonna lower the opacity of that layer, make a new layer. I'm gonna go in with a smaller brush now, still pretty chunky, like we're not going in with anything fine by any means. But now at this stage, we are just going all around his face. I kind of like to start with the sides of his face and the eyebrows and then move around the face to the rest of the features. But you just want to be looking at sort of how much space there is in between different features. So for example, how much space there is from his eyebrows to his, what's this little thing called? What do you call it? His little sideburn. I almost said starburns because I was thinking about Community, but okay, anyway, so little things like that you want to notice kind of. For example, I noticed the shape of his brow kind of wraps around and meets with the tip of his ear up here. I'm going to try not to turn this into so much of a lesson and just draw because, I don't know, it's kind of innate. I just want to explain exactly what I'm doing. I figured I would explain little parts of things, but I don't want to get so in depth that I am not efficiently drawing. So we're going to try to avoid that a little bit. But anyway, so under his eyes a little bit, he's got, I almost said some lovely bags, but I really do believe they're lovely. I think the shape of his face is really quite interesting. And I think bags are quite interesting. So you might think, lovely bags, that's a little ridiculous, but I think they're awesome to draw and to render. So Anyway, okay, so at this stage as well, I'm kind of mapping out certain areas. For example, his cheekbones and sort of the light, how the light is going to play on some of these areas. I am going to smudge this out in a little bit, so it's not going to matter too much, but I just want to get a general idea of these shapes while we're here. He's got also these really cool kind of jowls. I don't know if jowls is like offensive, but his features kind of hang a little bit lower, which is actually why I chose him as a reference to start my day off, because I just think his features are so interesting and so pronounced. Everything about his face is just so defined. Ears are also super duper important. We don't want to skip this step, especially in an older character like we're working with right now. Ears get larger as you age, and so it adds a nice addition of character to block this guy out a little bit. We've got a little bit of his collar from his shirt. I'm not going to focus really too much on his outfit, but we will get a little bit of his hair in here. His hair is such a crazy shape that I'm not going to really do too much on it right now. I'm just going to leave it like so. Okay, we're 5 minutes in. It's a little longer than I'd like to be. I'm going to lower the opacity of the first layer a little bit and then merge those two down. Next step, creating a lighter layer. We're going to go in with my hard round, slightly soft brush, one of my favorites, and actually a lower opacity layer. And I'm just going to create sort of the initial defining shadows of his face. So for example, on his forehead, his eyes are really quite shaded in, especially on the left-hand side, our left side, his right side. Going to create some shapes with his cheekbones a little bit in here. I'm not going to create super defined cheekbones right at this moment, but we're going to add a little bit of stuff to them right now. I haven't really left enough space for his chin, so that's something that I'm going to rework in a moment. But for now, we will just focus on the general shadows. Under his nose in this reference, there's quite a heavy shadow. Under his chin, there's quite a heavy shadow. His neck is fairly shaded in. His ear is actually quite light, so I'm going to make sure I leave that fairly light for now. Next up, now that we've got it kind of rendered to this level, I'm just going to throw in some darkness for his hair. We will touch that up in a little bit as well. A little bit for his collar in here. Very quick shapes for now. So next up, I'm going to make this a little bit smaller, just a touch, not freeform. Let's do that uniformly. I might actually freeform this for half a second and just make his face a little bit wider, just because this reference, he's got such a wide face, and I don't know, it's crazy. I was taking a look at his features a little bit before, off camera, before I started this, and it's just crazy how elongated some of his features are, how wide some of his features are. So next up, I'm just going around the shapes that I've already created, and I am smudging some areas out, along with kind of pushing the lighting around a little bit. So for example, if I've made certain areas too dark or I haven't left enough space, now is kind of the time that I am pushing those things and making extra space, etc., etc. I can't wait for the next step. I'll show you guys in a moment. I'm just going to finish smudging this out. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. I'm like, oh, I can't wait to render some stuff. But I really am excited for what's coming up right after we finish smudging this out. So once again, as I'm smudging, I'm kind of pushing certain features around a little bit, making sure proportions are fairly accurate at this point. If I really wanted to spend a really long time on this portrait, I would spend a greater chunk of the beginning of this sketching out the features and sort of figuring out where a lot of things are first and foremost. But because I'm really spending such little time on this, I'm not going to worry about that too much today. So let's see. Underneath the eyebrows, I'm just going to create kind of in this section here, slightly darken this area up a little bit. Okay, so next up, new layer. This is my favorite step. We've already created some really nice shapes in here, so the next step is to go in with a more precise brush. This is one of my favorite brushes. It's called Soft Plus Edge, so you can see it's got one side that's kind of like an airbrush and the other that's really nice and crisp. So I really love this brush for especially quick portraits and kind of rendering out stuff like this. So because I don't like spending a lot of time sort of picking my blacks and whites, I kind of like to have a lot of variants of shades in this initial sketch, so I can really just pull and sort of color pick from the sketch itself. I really just hate going up to the corner and like having to select a dark color or a light color or whatever. I really just like choosing from what I've already established in the canvas, so that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm really just color picking the heck out of all of this. I'm really going a little bit too granular at this point. We're gonna zoom out a little bit more and just try to focus on getting in some big shapes at this point. Let's see, a little bit in between his brows, just slightly. We are going to blur this out a little bit afterwards as well, so although we are trying to get some more defined shapes at this point, it's not the end of the world if things are slightly off. Okay, so around his nose has a lot of really subtle shapes in it, so I want to make sure I'm trying to incorporate as many of those as I can. In a portrait, it's really important. I'm holding my face and squishing it up. I hope that doesn't look weird on camera. But in a portrait, it's really crucial that you pay attention to very small details. Otherwise, the whole portrait can fall quite flat. So I want to make sure I'm doing that as I go along. For example, just very small highlights and very small areas can make a huge difference in the overall outcome of the portrait. So we just want to be very mindful of those shapes as we go along. Like I said, though, I don't want to work too granular at this stage, so I'm just going to pull some colors and some shades from the face that I've established so far and just kind of shade his cheekbones a little bit. His cheekbones are actually very defined, so I want to make sure I'm incorporating that. He's got very large very wide set cheekbones. I don't know if I mentioned who this is, by the way. This is Song Kang-ho. He's from the movie Parasite, one of my favorite Korean actors. He really is such a star. He was in another movie that I watched recently, Taxi Driver, and that one was also freaking stellar. Everything that he's in is really powerful and really just so well done. But anyway, regardless, so at this stage, we are also kind of reshaping. I mean, we're always reshaping. Like if you find something that's off, you always want to take a little bit of time to make those adjustments. Like I said, those kind of small, subtle details will make all the difference in the overall outcome of the piece. So you want to be as precise as you can be. Obviously, you get faster with these things as you go along. So if you don't want to spend, 30 minutes on a portrait and you want to spend more like 4 hours on a portrait when you initially start, that's excellent. I will say though, if you're a beginner artist and you're new to drawing portraits, especially because they are so particular, rather than spending very large chunks of time drawing a single portrait, I would try to block that out into smaller chunks of time. So for example, working on multiple portraits for 1 hour rather than one portrait for multiple hours, simply because you really learn a whole lot more when you're breaking stuff into little chunks like that, like more like studying. I would really focus on studying light, on studying just all of these little shadows in here are essentially creating the shapes of the face, right? So anyway, at this point, I just want to create the shape of his lip. He's got a nice lighter gray upper lip, and he's got a very nice defined crease for his lip line. So oh my gosh, my voice is breaking a little bit. I've really been chatting quite a bit throughout this video, but I want to keep it lightly informative at the same time. So hopefully hopefully it's not too overwhelming or not enough. If you'd like me to go a little more in depth about how I go about creating these shapes and how I go about sort of studying the form of the face a little bit more, feel free to send me a DM or something. I'm happy to check those and get back to you when I can. Anyway, so at this point, I'm just making sure I'm creating kind of these nice subtle lines and things. Like I said, I am going to kind of blend this out a little bit more in a moment, but I want to kind of get them in just a little bit while I'm here. So, like I said, he's got very defined kind of jowls, and I don't know if that's a bad word, jowls. Like, it sounds a little bit cruel and rude, but he really does. And with an older face especially, like, your features aren't going to be so tight. But I think that it makes for a lot of very interesting shadows. So I really like to draw older faces. Sometimes I'll just spend a few hours just sitting and drawing like older portraits, because the light will hit a face so much more differently when you've got all these areas kind of drooping is probably not the best word, but you probably know what I mean at this point. Anyway, so we are once again working a little too granular, so I'm going to just zoom out and make a new layer, and I'm just going to throw some hair in for now to kind of create a little bit of shape for his head. Now, like I said, his hair is huge. His hair is a lot bigger than I was anticipating when I initially saw this reference and sort of looked at it for a moment. So I want to make sure I'm capturing that hair nicely. We're going off the canvas a little bit, which I don't like, so I'm just going to combine this down for a second, drag him down a little bit just so I'm not creating any hard lines at the top, any separation that looks awkward. Okay, so let's go in with some nice rich blacks just in a few areas. I like to be quite sparse with my blacks because you really don't see, like, if you add too many blacks, you're losing the contrast of the rest of the piece, so I don't want to be so overwhelming with them. And I'm really not going to focus on his hair too much because I think his features, like, there's so much to focus on there that I don't want to get wrapped up in his hair too much, at least not just yet. So let's focus on the shapes of the light kind of around his lips. He's got a lot of really light areas right around his lips, and then his nose is quite light as well, but his nose has a lot of really interesting shadows right beneath it, and sort of these little divots in his nose too. So I'm going to merge that all down. We're going to flatten all of that. I'm going to spend a little bit of time blending out some areas. We're 16 minutes in. So that's at a good place where we still have ample time. Like I said, I only really want to work on this for about 30 minutes. So we still have ample time to adjust some things and create heavier set shadows, etc. Kind of rearrange some different areas. So I'm at a happy place in terms of how far into this portrait we are. I don't want to over smudge at this point. That's something you want to be kind of careful of. Like, we've spent so much time kind of creating nice little textures that you don't want to just smooth them all away. So I'm going to be very careful, just kind of adding some very subtle blurring effects around his lips. I want to darken up underneath his lips quite a bit too, right down in here. And that's something I was going to mention before. I don't actually know if I already mentioned this, but I used to really work at kind of smoothing the features and sort of the tones of the face first and foremost, and then really going back and adding texture afterwards. But nowadays I find it's so much easier, and it comes out so much nicer if you really just try to preserve those textures as you're working, rather than like really smoothing stuff out and then going back and adding them, because a lot of those textures have so much depth behind them that if you try to add them just at the very end, they look flat, I would say. They fall kind of short. So that's just something I've noticed in my own work lately that I'm trying to incorporate in these pieces as I go along. For example, the little sort of wrinkles that are around his eyes, if I just went in and added those at the very end, they would look kind of unnatural and a little bit boring. So you want to try to add those as you're going along. Certain things I would save for the very end. For example, the very bright whites in a face. I'm always going to save those kind of towards the end. I'm going to work quite neutral for the most part, and then those really light highlights I will save. I might add a couple in right now just because, once again, it is such a short time for a portrait, so I want to get as many details as I can in as I'm going along. But for the most part, you want to avoid adding too much of that until you're kind of wrapping up. Now he's got such a nice curve at the side of his face here that I really want to try to add that in. He's got a nice dark cheekbone at the side here. Now it's also really important, we've got about 10 minutes left, really important that we define this ear. As I was saying earlier, his ear, because he's an older character, his ear is going to be quite large. I actually don't know if I said this earlier either. I was thinking this earlier. I don't know if I actually mentioned it, but because he's older, his ear is quite large, and if we don't include that in the portrait, it'll make the other features maybe not look as big in comparison. It can kind of just throw the whole portrait off a little bit if you don't have that sizing accurately for little features like that. That's to say, if you're trying to work from a reference, and if you don't have an ear in front of you, obviously you can make it kind of however big or however small as you'd like. But as we age, our ears tend to get larger, along with our noses too. So we'll make those features nice and big. Okay, so we're going to add a little bit of his hair wrapping around his ear, also to make this ear pop a little bit more. So right in behind, like so. What I'm going to do next, I'm really just going to very quickly shade in his neck a little bit. Like I mentioned earlier, I'm really not going to focus too much on his other features, like his neck and his shirt and whatever's going on otherwise, but I just want a little bit of that in there to show off different shapes and sizes of things. This part in here actually isn't more of his shoulder, it's actually the collar of his neck, so those little details are quite important, once again, to kind of give context to the portrait. A little bit of a collar in here. You can see how useful it is to pick tones from the portrait as well. So like I said, I already established quite a wide variety of grays in this portrait, so now it's really easy to just pick from what we've established already, and it just makes the whole process quite a lot faster. I'm going to zoom in a little bit at this stage. I really don't want to stay zoomed in, but I just want to really make sure I'm getting his eye in quite nicely and all of the little shadows around his eye. Of course, our eyes are so expressive, so you really want to be particular about those shapes, but you want to be particular about all of your shapes, really, so try to be as accurate as you can be with all of those little areas. Under his eye a little bit in here. I don't want to get too dark or too heavy with my strokes at this point, but I am going to go kind of around his nose, and like I said, I don't really like to add bright whites until the very end, but I think we can benefit from going a little bit lighter on the bridge of his nose, just to really make this area pop. I'm once again not really going in with whites at this point. In fact, I don't think I'll add any of those for this entire portrait, really, but I don't think it really needs it, but what was I gonna say? But a little bit here and there. It's a really nice touch for now. Once again, not going super duper light, just kind of emphasizing sort of the curves of his lips a little bit. Certain areas in here. A little bit under his jowls. Once again, it's probably the wrong term, but we'll call them jowls for now. A little bit around his cheeks. I just want to make sure I'm being as accurate as I can be with the the shade of his face, how light or how dark everything is. Oh my gosh, Gus. Hi. Can you guys hear Gus? Probably. Oh, hello, Gustavo. Hi. I'm propping him up with my knee. That's something I was going to do. I totally forgot about that. I'm going to make a new layer, and I'm going to take a really rich black, and I'm just going to go under his face a little bit to create a nice amount of depth under his neck area in here. And now is a good time to, I'm just going to take this black and just very lightly brush it in a few different places. I don't want to be too heavy with it. What I might do as well is kind of take the liquify tool and just drag around a few features before I call this portrait finished. I haven't really rendered this side of his eye too much. It's kind of neglected it, but a little bit of blacks underneath his brow. I want to make sure I'm accurate about the shape of a brow too. Gosh, Gus is so loud, isn't he? But just the shapes of eyebrows and things like that will change the portrait so significantly, so you want to be as careful with those areas as you can be. Okay, at this stage we are 25 minutes in. We have a fairly rendered portrait at this point. If I were working on this for a significant amount of time rather than 30 minutes, I would spend a greater time sketching out these features, all that good stuff beforehand, so I can get really accurate with the shapes of things before rendering out these details. But I think we've captured him fairly well for the amount of time that I've allotted myself. So last but not least, we're gonna, right before I finish off rendering these little areas, like I said, I'm just going to liquefy his face a little tiny bit. Just spend a moment adjusting a few things. Oops. Just very subtly, kind of making things slightly larger where I need them. His ear is quite large, for example. He has such a freaking wide face, which I love. Such interesting shapes in his face. Okay. 4 minutes left. Well, not really left, but in my goal. I'm just going to smudge out a few areas that I don't think need to be quite so harsh. Once again, we don't want to over smudge anything because we want to make sure those super duper tiny little wrinkles and everything are still preserved. I don't want to get rid of those right off the bat. In fact, I'm going to go in and define a few of them and just make sure the shape of his brow is fairly decent. Adding in a few strands of hair to cover up some areas of his face. Like I said, I really wasn't too concerned about his hair for this portrait, like it's so messy in the reference. But a little bit, like a couple strands here and there, can really add a bit of character to a portrait like this, especially being so fast. And a few more things to do here. We want to darken up sort of the side of his jaw that's underneath of his ear over here. Where else do we want to darken? I think we want to darken a little bit more in here, but then lighten up right below it. I think we've created a little bit too much extra chin over here. That sounds bad, but kind of a little bit too extra. Lighten up right below it. What else are we missing here? It's kind of lighter right under his chin in here. His chin shape is a little more wide than I've got it so far. He's got a lighter area below, or sorry, next to his mouth at this side over here. Let's see, what can we do? Lighten up his cheek a little bit. His nose is really quite downturned, so I want to make sure I'm emphasizing that shape. It's a little bit too much. What I do want to do, I want to take the gray from the background and kind of carve out the shape of his face a little bit better. I'm so sorry, my voice is so raspy at this point. Like I really haven't stopped chatting, just non-stop It's just a very, everything that I'm thinking, I'm just spitting out right away, you know. Okay, a little bit of the shape of his cheek over there, shape of his hair a little bit. Let's darken, or rather than darken, let's kind of adjust the shapes in his ear a little. And I would say we're almost done. It's 29 minutes in, so we pretty much hit the mark in terms of time. I feel like I could have been more accurate with certain areas, but like I said, this is just a warm-up, so I'm not disappointed in where it's at. Oops. I am going to just take a few areas and kind of brighten them up just in the last little bit of time that we've got. Couple of areas in his cheek. If I really wanted to be precise about this, like I would go back and forth, creating some really nice textures and stuff. But such is life. We are just about out of time anyway. And I've got other stuff that I'd like to move on to for the day. I'm just going to create, I know we're out of time technically, 30 minutes, but I'm just going to add a few subtle details. For example, his eyelashes in the reference. I really love his little eyelashes, so I want to make sure I add them a little bit in there and just kind of redefine the shape of that eye a little bit, as well as it's kind of a lighter gray on this eyebrow. Okay, so this is what a warm-up looks like for me. In a general sense, I usually spend about 30 minutes for each little portrait that I do, sometimes longer, sometimes shorter. A warm-up for me, I would say, is kind of anything that falls in that range of time. But anyway, just to get myself situated with all the values and everything. Sometimes when you go to sleep and you wake up, it's just like your brain doesn't work right away. So anyway, that looks fairly okay to me. I'm just kind of adjusting a couple more things just before I call it quits. Just little areas that I noticed that I think are important for the portrait. Let's see. Do I want to liquefy this right at the end and just kind of rearrange a few little details? You know what? I think I will not, but I will just adjust this side of his face a little bit. That looks okay. That looks okay. I'm always super hypercritical about my portraits, especially at the end when I'm like, what can I change? What can I adjust? All this stuff. I'm noticing his lip should be a little lighter. Like, I could go on for ages and just keep going with super duper itty bitty little areas that you want to lighten or areas that you want to darken, all that stuff. But for the most part, I'm fairly happy with it. I'm not going to touch it too much because I don't want to spend too much more time on it. There's always going to be something to add too, so such is the nature of a drawing. You can keep going forever and ever and just you don't want to stop. But one more little detail in here. And I would say that is a portrait. Actually, one last thing. I know I just said one last thing, but one last thing is the shape of the shadow. He's got quite a pronounced little area right in his nose, right over here. Okay, yeah, I think I'm cool to call this quits for now. Like I said, I really don't want to work on it too much longer than that. Roughly 30 minutes, not too bad. Let's see, where's my little countdown timery thing? Let me pause that. All right, what would I change about this before I just end this little segment here? What would I change about this? So, I would change sort of the shape of his lips quite a bit. I think his chin shape could be a little bit wider. The shadows below his neck could be a lot darker. They could be a little more defined. The little wrinkles in his eyes I might change a little bit more. There's kind of a whole shaded area that I sort of missed in the reference. His forehead could be shaded a little bit more as well. Like there's tons of little stuff that I could go over. The shape of his nose I would make a little bit longer, and I would make the shadows underneath of his nose a little bit higher. Little stuff like that. But for the most part, I'm pretty happy with it. We're going to move on to some other work now. So anyway, take care, guys. Bye.